I didn't disappear suddenly. I learned how to become invisible. Not physically, emotionally. Gradually. Carefully. In a way that looked like kindness from the outside and survival from the inside. I learned early that being too much made people leave. Too emotional. Too honest. Too needy. Too complicated. So I adjusted. At first, it felt like adaptation. Like learning how relationships worked. I told myself that everyone compromises, that connection requires restraint, that love is about meeting people where they are, not overwhelming them with who you are. So I softened myself. I listened more than I spoke. I agreed more than I questioned. I learned how to read a room and edit myself accordingly. If something hurt me, I decided it probably wasn't worth mentioning. If something mattered deeply to me, I downplayed it. I became easy to be around. People liked that. They told me I was calm. Understanding. Low drama. The kind of person who never made things uncomfortable. I took those words as proof that I was doing something right. I didn't realize they were instructions. Over time, I stopped bringing my full self into spaces. I brought a version that was lighter, quieter, less demanding. A version that didn't require much attention or care. That version survived. The rest of me waited. I told myself this was maturity. That wanting too much was childish. That if I made myself smaller, relationships would feel safer, more stable. And they did, in a way. No one left dramatically. They just never fully arrived either. I noticed it first in conversations. People spoke around me instead of to me. They shared surface-level things, never quite stepping into depth. When I hinted at something heavier, the moment passed quickly, redirected back to neutral ground. I smiled and followed. That was my role. I didn't ask for more because asking felt dangerous. I had learned that visibility came with risk, and I was tired of losing people. Tired of feeling like my presence was something that needed to be managed. So I made myself manageable. I became agreeable instead of expressive. Reliable instead of real. I told myself that if I stayed useful and pleasant, no one would have a reason to leave. And it worked. People stayed. But they stayed with the version of me that asked for nothing. Late at night, alone, I felt a quiet ache I couldn't explain. Not loneliness exactly, something closer to being unseen. Like standing in a room full of people who know your name but not your inner weather. I told myself I was lucky. That many people would trade places with me. That connection, even shallow connection, was better than none. But there's a cost to being invisible. You stop checking whether you exist. I began to lose track of my own emotional reactions. When something hurt, I noticed it intellectually before I felt it. When something mattered to me, I questioned whether it was reasonable to care. I filtered myself so consistently that eventually, I didn't know what I was filtering from. I became good at being needed and bad at being known. That distinction matters more than people admit. There was a moment, small, unremarkable, when I realized something was wrong. Someone I cared about forgot something important to me. Not maliciously. Not carelessly. Simply because I had never made it visible that it mattered. I laughed it off. Said it was fine. Later, alone, I felt an unexpected wave of grief. Not because they forgot but because I had trained them to. That was the night I understood the truth I had been avoiding. People weren't overlooking me. They were responding to who I had taught them I was. Invisible people don't get abandoned. They get overlooked. And I had chosen that trade without realizing what it would cost me. I wasn't unloved. I was unexperienced. My life was full of connection and empty of intimacy. Full of presence and absent of recognition. I was surrounded and deeply alone in a way that didn't show. The worst part wasn't that people didn't see me. It was that I had stopped trying to be seen. Because being seen meant risking loss. And I had decided, long ago, that survival mattered more than authenticity. I didn't know then that survival without visibility slowly erases you. But I was about to find out. Once the idea took hold, I couldn't unfeel it. The sense of being unseen stopped being abstract and became physical. A pressure behind my eyes. A tightness in my throat whenever I almost said something honest and swallowed it at the last second. Silence was no longer calm, it was heavy. I started noticing patterns I had ignored for years. How people assumed my availability without asking. How decisions that affected me were made in rooms I wasn't invited into. How my preferences were treated as flexible by default. Not out of cruelty, out of habit. I had trained them well. The realization triggered something close to panic, but quieter. Not a breakdown that collapses you, but one that wakes you up in the middle of the night with your heart racing and no clear reason why. I began to replay conversations from the past, searching for proof that I had once been visible. Moments where I had spoken honestly and survived. They existed, but they were rare, and they faded quickly under layers of adaptation. I realized I had confused being tolerated with being accepted. Toleration requires silence. Acceptance requires presence. I had chosen the former because it felt safer. The emotional cost of that choice finally surfaced. I felt resentment toward people I cared about, and then immediate guilt for feeling it. After all, they hadn't taken anything from me. I had withheld it. That's when the mental breakdown truly began, not as chaos, but as clarity that refused to soften itself. I saw how often I had edited myself to fit into spaces that never asked me to. How often I had anticipated rejection and adjusted in advance. I had lived my entire emotional life preemptively. The fear beneath it all was painfully simple. If I become visible, I might be left. That fear had guided every interaction. It had taught me to stay agreeable, to avoid friction, to prioritize being easy over being honest. It had convinced me that love was conditional, that it existed only as long as I didn't ask too much. I didn't know when I learned that lesson. I only knew how deeply it had shaped me. One evening, during a conversation that should have felt intimate, I realized something devastating. The person across from me was sharing something deeply personal, and I was listening with care, empathy, and attention. But I wasn't sharing anything back. Not because I didn't trust them. Because I didn't know how. I had forgotten how to place myself into a moment without minimizing my presence. Without framing my experience as less important, less urgent, less heavy. I left that conversation feeling hollow. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. That night, I admitted something to myself I had avoided for years. I was lonely not for people, but for recognition. I wasn't craving attention. I was craving acknowledgement. The feeling that my inner world mattered enough to be known, not managed. The ethical dilemma that followed was unbearable. If I stayed invisible, I would keep my connections shallow, stable, intact. If I became visible, I might lose them. I had always chosen stability. But now stability felt like slow erasure. I started noticing how often I felt relieved when plans were cancelled, when conversations stayed surface level, when nothing required me to show up fully. That relief terrified me. It meant I was avoiding myself as much as I was avoiding rejection. I began to ask questions that had no comfortable answers. What if no one stays once they really see me? What if I'm too much? What if I've been invisible for so long that visibility itself feels unsafe? Those questions followed me everywhere. The fear intensified when I imagined speaking honestly for the first time, not dramatically, not explosively, but plainly. Saying what I wanted. Saying when something hurt. Saying when I needed more. The imagined aftermath was unbearable. Awkward silence. Changed dynamics. Distance. Loss. I realized something crucial then. I had been measuring safety incorrectly. I thought safety meant no one leaving. I hadn't considered whether it meant being known. I had chosen survival over intimacy, not once, but every day, in 1,000 small ways. And now, the survival strategy was killing something essential inside me. That's when invisibility stopped feeling protective. It started feeling like a cage. A cage I had built carefully, patiently, out of good intentions and fear. A cage that kept me connected but never truly seen. The pressure reached a breaking point not because something external changed, but because I could no longer ignore the cost. I understood that if I continued like this, my life would remain full and completely empty of me. And for the first time, that outcome felt more frightening than being left. The moment I stopped being invisible didn't feel brave. It felt reckless. Not in a dramatic sense, there were no raised voices, no ultimatums, but reckless in the way honesty feels when you've built your entire life around containment. I didn't plan it carefully. I didn't wait until I felt ready. Readiness had never arrived for me before, and I finally understood it never would. I spoke because not speaking had become unbearable. The words came out unevenly. Not polished. Not confident. I didn't frame them as demands or accusations. I didn't ask anyone to change. I just placed myself into the room in a way I never had before. I said what mattered to me. I said when something hurt. I said that being easy had cost me more than I admitted. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument I had imagined. People looked at me differently, not unkindly, but uncertainly. As if they were seeing a depth they hadn't known existed and weren't sure what to do with it. I felt exposed in a way I had spent years avoiding. And for a moment, I panicked. The old instinct surged back immediately, the urge to minimize, to reassure, to say it wasn't that important, to pull myself back into invisibility so everything could return to normal. I didn't. That was the point of no return. Once you let yourself be seen, even imperfectly, you can't pretend you're invisible anymore. You can retreat physically, but the knowledge remains. You know what it feels like to occupy space honestly. The consequences arrived quietly. Some people stepped back. Not cruelly. Just subtly, like someone adjusting to a new shape in the room. I felt the loss of ease almost immediately. Conversations became less automatic. Assumptions dissolved. I was no longer the default calm presence that smoothed everything over. That hurt. I once pretended didn't. But something else happened alongside the loss. Relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying everything alone. I wasn't editing myself in real time. I wasn't managing my own disappearance. The tension I had lived with for so long loosened its grip. I realized then that invisibility had never truly kept people from leaving. It had only ensured that if they stayed with a version of me that didn't exist. Some relationships didn't survive the shift. That grief is real, and I carry it with me. Being seen comes with risk, and sometimes the cost is exactly what you feared all along. But the relationships that remained changed fundamentally. They became slower. Less smooth. More awkward at times. But they were real. They involved negotiation instead of assumption, presence instead of performance. And for the first time, I felt known, not entirely, not perfectly, but enough to feel alive inside my own life. I didn't suddenly become confident. I still feel the pull to disappear sometimes, to soften myself, to return to the safety of being agreeable. Old habits don't vanish just because you name them. But now, when that impulse appears, I recognize it. It's fear, not wisdom. I understand something now that I wish I had known earlier. Being invisible doesn't guarantee safety. It guarantees absence. It keeps people from leaving loudly, but it also keeps them from ever fully arriving. And it teaches you to accept connection without recognition, presence without intimacy. I stayed invisible so no one would leave me. What I didn't understand was that by doing so, I had already left myself. Visibility didn't fix my life. It complicated it. But complication is where truth lives. And truth, even when it costs you comfort, gives you something invisibility never can. A place in your own story? If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, ask yourself one quiet question. Are you staying unseen to survive? Or are you surviving something that no longer deserves your silence because being seen is risky? But disappearing is permanent. That's the choice I finally stopped avoiding. And that's why I chose to be visible even if it meant being left.